In the early 19th century, southern Africa was undergoing a seismic transformation. Tribes, clans, and kingdoms were engaged in an ever-shifting struggle for dominance, an era later remembered as the Mbopha, or the crushing. It was a time of upheaval, displacement, and ambition. Yet amid the chaos, one name would rise above the rest and come to define an entire generation of power: Shaka Zulu. Shaka was no ordinary leader. Born into a period of instability, he transformed adversity into strategy and personal pain into political ambition. Through raw military innovation and unmatched discipline, Shaka built the Zulu Kingdom into a fearsome regional force. He introduced the short stabbing spear, the deadly buffalo horn formation, and a code of loyalty so intense it bordered on the divine. Under his rule, the Zulu army was not just a fighting force, it was a way of life. But this story is not merely a tribute to Shaka's greatness. It's a story of trust and treachery. It's about the man who stood closest to the flame and then helped snuff it out. That man was Mbopha KaSithayi. To most, Mabopa was a royal attendant, a quiet figure in the court. But in truth, he was far more than that. Mabopa was Shaka's confidant, a man entrusted with secrets, strategies, and ceremonial duties. He had access not only to the king's court, but to his mind. Some say Mabopa understood Shaka better than his own brothers did. And yet, in 1828, it was Mabopa who helped orchestrate the king's assassination. Why? Was it ambition? Fear? Patriotism? Or was it something darker, something personal? Before we answer that, we must look deeper into the world of these two men, into the battlefield, the royal hut, and the politics of power. Because this is not just a tale of betrayal, it's a story of legacy, of how one man's knife ended a reign and how history remembers them both. Mabopa KaSithayi was no mere courtier. Born into the respected Sithai clan known for its history of service and loyalty, Mabopa was raised with a deep understanding of tribal protocol, leadership, and the delicate dance of power. He was taught early on that proximity to power was both a privilege and a burden. And in the Zulu Kingdom under Shaka, that burden was especially heavy. As Shaka rose from obscurity to become the most feared monarch in southern Africa, he built a system of governance centered around a close circle of trusted advisors known as the Izinduna. These men weren't just political figures. They were warriors, strategists, and the gatekeepers to the king. They had the king's ear, and in many ways, they were the spine of the Zulu administrative machine. Mabopa climbed quickly through these ranks. He proved himself on the battlefield and in council chambers. He was articulate, composed, and fiercely loyal. Unlike many who sought favor through flattery, Mabopa was respected for his discretion. He spoke when needed, and when he spoke, even Shaka listened. But loyalty has limits, especially when it's tested by blood. As the Zulu Empire expanded, Shaka's rule became increasingly erratic. The pressures of governing, the constant fear of betrayal, and the devastating loss of his beloved mother, Queen Nandi, sent him into a dark spiral. He ordered mass executions for imagined conspiracies. His mourning rituals, such as banning the planting of crops and the use of milk, pushed his people to the brink of starvation. Shaka, once a visionary leader, began to rule through fear. Mabopa watched this transformation with unease. The man he had once admired, the warrior king who had united a people, was now unraveling. The Izinduna whispered in corners. A people murmured in fear. And Mabopa, once a pillar of Shaka's regime, began to ask the unthinkable. What happens when a king becomes the greatest threat to his own kingdom? The seeds of doubt had been planted, and in the shadows of the royal kraal, those seeds began to grow. In the winter of 1827, the Zulu Kingdom was shaken not by war, but by grief. Queen Nandi, the mother of Shaka, and arguably the most important woman in his life, had died. To most, it was a tragic loss. But for Shaka, it was a psychological breaking point. The mourning was not just intense, it was apocalyptic. Shaka decreed that no crops be planted for the rest of the year. He banned the consumption of milk, a staple of the Zulu diet. Anyone who showed even a hint of joy or failed to weep openly was killed. Thousands were executed, men, women, children. He even ordered the murder of pregnant women, claiming that no birth should dare coincide with the death of his mother. The kingdom descended into a state of terror. What was once a proud, disciplined empire had become a land of paranoia and death. Fields lay fallow. Cattle went unmilked. Hunger and fear crept into every kraal, every hut, every heart. Mabopa had seen Shaka change over the years, but this was beyond loyalty. This was madness. And so, in the shadows of the royal court, Mabopa began to act. He reached out to Shaka's half-brothers Dingaan and Malanjano. They too had grown wary. The bond that had once united the royal siblings under Shaka's iron will had frayed beyond repair. They were princes, but with no real power. Worse, like everyone else, they feared for their lives. The three met in secret, behind reed fences and under the cover of night. At first, they exchanged observations, worries, then frustrations, and finally, one conclusion. If Shaka continued on this path, there would be no Zulu kingdom left to rule. This wasn't just about ambition, it was about preservation. And so, a deadly pact was made. Dingaan and Malanjana would provide the support. But it was Mabopa trusted, familiar, and always close to the king who would deliver him. He would be the one to lead Shaka into a trap. He would be the hand that opened the door. And with that, the fate of an empire was sealed in whispers and blood. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. On the evening of September 22nd, 1828, Shaka Zulu was in Kodukuzo, his royal homestead and military stronghold. It was a place he felt safe, surrounded by loyal guards, advisors, and warriors. But trust, as it turns out, would be his downfall. Mabopa entered the enclosure with his usual calm. To any outsider, it was just another evening visitor, trusted Izinduna checking on the king. Perhaps he even exchanged a joke with Shaka, easing him into a sense of comfort. After all, Mabopa had spent years by Shaka's side. Who better to get close unnoticed? And then, in a quiet gesture that changed the course of history, Mabopa gave the signal. From the shadows, Dingaan and Malanjana stepped forward, daggers in hand. The betrayal was swift and brutal. Shaka tried to resist, his warrior instincts kicking in, even in that moment of shock, but it was too late. He was overpowered, stabbed repeatedly, and left gasping for air in the very kraal he had built with fear and authority. The king who had turned the Zulu into a dominant southern African force was dead. His body was dragged from the scene and hidden. No royal burial, no public mourning. He was buried in an unmarked grave, its location still unknown to this day. Some say the conspirators wanted to erase his legacy. Others believe they feared retaliation if his resting place became a shrine. When the word spread, the Zulu nation stood frozen. For some, it was the end of an era, a moment of deep sorrow and uncertainty. Shaka had brought unity, strength, and pride. But for others, his death was a liberation. His recent reign had been marked by bloodshed, cruelty, and unspeakable grief. For them, this was a turning point, a release from tyranny. And at the center of this moment stood Mbopha KaSithayi, the trusted confidant, the loyal advisor, the ultimate traitor. His hand had delivered the fatal blow, not just to a man, but to a legend. And with that, the course of the Zulu Kingdom changed forever. In the eerie calm that followed Shaka's assassination, the Zulu Kingdom held its breath. The blood of the empire's founder was barely dry when Dingaan, Shaka's half-brother and one of the chief conspirators, moved quickly to claim the throne. At first, things appeared orderly. Dingaan addressed the nation with promises of peace and stability. He pledged to restore balance, to undo the madness of Shaka's final days. The people, exhausted by grief and terror, seemed willing to accept the new ruler, if only for the promise of relief. Mabopa KaSithayi, instrumental in bringing down the mighty king, found himself near the seat of power once again. After all, without his role, Dingaan might never have risen. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Mbopa's gamble had paid off. But power is a currency hoarded, not shared. Within weeks, Dingaan began to show signs of distrust, especially toward those who had helped him seize power. Chief among them were Malanjina, his fellow brother, and Mabopa, the trusted insider. In Dingaan's eyes, anyone capable of betraying a king was a potential threat to his own reign. Malanjina was the first to fall. Lured into a trap, he was executed under mysterious circumstances. No official charges, no trial. Just silence and a vanished name. It was a chilling reminder that in the world of royal succession, allies often become liabilities. As for Mabopa, the story becomes clouded by legend and contradiction. Some historical accounts claim he was immediately executed after Malanjana swept away in Dingaan's purge of possible challengers. Others suggest he vanished from court life, perhaps exiled or quietly removed from all positions of influence. There are even whispers that he was assassinated in secret, buried without ceremony like the king he betrayed. Regardless of the specifics, one truth stands firm: betrayal breeds betrayal. Mabopa had played the role of kingmaker, but he failed to realize that in the game of power, kingmakers rarely survive. His usefulness expired the moment the crown found a new head. And so, like the man he helped destroy, Mabopa disappeared into the shadows of history, remembered not for the years of loyal service, but for the blade he helped thrust into the heart of an empire. Today, the name Mbopha KaSithayi doesn't appear on monuments. There are no statues carved in his likeness, no holidays in his honor. And yet, his legacy lives on, in whispers, in stories, in classroom debates, and in fireside folktales passed down through generations. He remains one of the most polarizing figures in South African history. To some, he is the quintessential traitor, the man who struck down Shaka Zulu, a unifier, a military genius, and a symbol of African strength. In this view, Mbopha's name is spoken with bitterness, etched into memory as the betrayer who brought down a king. But others take a different view. To them, Mabopa is a tragic figure, caught in the storm of a crumbling monarchy. A man torn between loyalty and survival, who watched his leader descend into madness and feared for the future of an entire nation. They see him not as a villain, but as a man pushed to make an impossible choice, one that history has judged harshly. And then there are those who see him as a necessary evil. In this interpretation, Mabopa acted not out of hatred or ambition, but out of a desire to save the Zulu Kingdom from self-destruction. Under Shaka's increasingly violent rule, the kingdom was on the brink of collapse. Perhaps, they argue, the assassination was the only way to stop the bleeding. This complexity is reflected in Zulu oral tradition. In some folktales, Mabopa is cast as the shadowy betrayer, lurking in the background, always watching. In others, he's depicted as a reluctant hero, a man who chose his people over his king. The stories vary by region, by storyteller, by time. But one thing is constant: Mabopa is never forgotten. And perhaps that's what makes his story so powerful. Because history isn't made of facts alone, it's made of memory, of interpretation, of the way we carry stories forward. Mbopa's legacy is messy, contradictory, and deeply human. He held the knife that ended a reign. But he also held the burden of choice, of conscience, of consequence. And in the end, that burden may be heavier than the blade. What does this story teach us about power, about leadership, and about betrayal? Shaka Zulu was, without question, a visionary. His rise to power wasn't an accident. It was built through brilliant military reforms, strategic diplomacy, and an uncanny ability to inspire fear and loyalty. He revolutionized the art of war in southern Africa, turning a loose collection of clans into a disciplined and unified kingdom. Under his leadership, the Zulu nation didn't just grow, it transformed. But greatness has a shadow. And Shaka's brilliance came with a cost. As his power expanded, so too did his paranoia. The trauma of endless battles, the constant fear of rebellion, and the devastating loss of his mother drove him into a spiral of brutality. Ritual executions, mass mourning, psychological terror, these weren't tactics of a ruler in control. They were the signs of a man grasping to hold on to something already slipping away. Mabopa KaSithayi wasn't just another conspirator. He was someone who had stood beside Shaka at his highest and lowest. He knew the king intimately, his strengths, his fears, and his growing instability. So when Mabopa turned against him, it wasn't simply treason. It was the collapse of trust, the breaking of a bond between a leader and his closest advisor. And that is perhaps the greatest lesson of all. Power unchecked corrodes even the strongest empires. When leaders begin to fear their own people more than they listen to them, when brutality replaces justice, and paranoia replaces wisdom, downfall is inevitable. Not always through revolution or uprising. Sometimes, as in Shaka's case, it comes silently, in a quiet moment, in a private room, with a trusted voice and a hidden knife. History is full of such stories, where greatness breeds isolation, and isolation breeds demise. Shaka's fall is not just a tale of one man's failure, but a mirror reflecting what happens when power loses its way. Mabopa held the blade, yes, but the wound was years in the making. And perhaps that's the harshest truth of all. Mbopha KaSithayi made a decision, one that would change the fate of a kingdom and echo through African history for generations. He stood at a crossroads between loyalty and survival, between continuing to serve a man who had lost his grip on reality, or stepping into the shadows of betrayal to stop the collapse of everything they had built together. Was it the right choice? That's the question that refuses to fade. Some call him a traitor. Others call him a savior. But perhaps the truth is more complicated. Shaka was no ordinary ruler. He was a force of nature, fierce, brilliant, and terrifying. Under his leadership, the Zulu Kingdom rose like never before. But near the end, that same brilliance became a storm that consumed everything in its path: his enemies, his people, and eventually his own peace of mind. Mabopa wasn't just reacting to madness. He was trying to prevent a collapse, to stop a kingdom from falling deeper into the abyss. But he did it the only way he could, in silence, with steel and with blood on his hands. And so we're left with the eternal question: would you betray a tyrant to save your people? That's the power of history. It's not about heroes or villains. It's about people flawed, complex, and forced to make choices under unbearable pressure. Mabopa didn't write his name into history books with speeches or conquests. He wrote it with a single act. And that act reshaped the legacy of an empire. If this story made you pause, made you think, made you feel something, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. We explore the forgotten corners of African and South African history, where truth is tangled in myth, and every name hides a deeper story. So, if you haven't already, subscribe. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next story. And let's talk in the comments. What would you have done in Mbopha's place? Was it betrayal or bravery? See you in the next one. And until then, remember, history lives in the choices we make.